I promised you a year 2021 update for the Bradley fighting vehicle, and here it is. While there were few actual topics for the Bradley, compared to the updates I wrote for the Stryker and Abrams, the details of each sprawled out more and more as I pored over the articles about them. And suffice to say, the Bradley's future is looking pretty bleak, although this won't surprise anyone capable of being honest with themselves about what a complete dumpster fire the Bradley always was and will be. For a quick reference before we begin, I will be referring to each generation of the Bradley collectively by an A prefix and a number. Allow me to explain this, to prevent any confusion. For example, an M2A1 Bradley will be referred to as an A1 Bradley, while an M38 CFV will be referred to as an A2 Bradley. First generation Bradleys, namely the M2 Bradley and M3 CFV, will collectively be referred to as A0 Bradleys, which is also a common practice in the US military. That said, there's a lot of ground to cover here, so let's get started. There have been multiple successive efforts to replace the Bradley fighting vehicle since the mid-1990s. One was just started last year, and all of its predecessors met with grief. All of these vehicles are so ridiculous that they almost make the Bradley seem sensible by comparison. Also, this is going to be a long one, so throw on a fresh pair of panties. The first of these was the MGV, or Manned Ground Vehicle, which was conceived in 1995 as part of the FCS, Future Combat Systems, program. For those of you who don't recall the original promise for the MGV, or weren't born yet, for those of you who are adults, or in your late teens, let that sink in for a moment. It was promised to be much more heavily armed and armored than the M2A3 Bradley, carry at least 6 passengers, small enough to fit inside a C-130J Super Hercules, and at a combat weight of only 18 short tons, could be airlifted to beyond 1,000 miles in said aircraft. For those of you who aren't already laughing at the sheer stupidity of the MGV's requirements, or rather its desirements, they were so impossible that it's astounding grown men could have conceived of such a vehicle, let alone a committee of industry experts and US Army generals. The 20-ton figure is the never-exceed payload of the C-130J, not its maximum operational payload. It would be lucky to reach a distance of 400 miles while carrying 18 short tons, and requires concrete reinforced runways more than a mile long at both ends to avoid overrunning or rutting into the runway. With the amount of protection and firepower the M2A3 Bradley has, it weighs 33 short tons, not 18 short tons. And given the ratchet effect of consistent past behavior in US military procurement, and the obvious fact that the best predictor of future behavior is relevant past behavior, the MGV would inevitably weigh more than the Bradley no matter what, not less. And sure enough, when the actual functioning MGV prototypes were finally built more than a decade later, they weighed 24 short tons. The US Army explained that this growth in weight was because the MGV was no longer required to be transported via C-130. As though this fig leaf was somehow large enough to hide the fact that airlift by C-130 was a central pillar of the entire FCS program, and that the Army failed to achieve this end. By the time the MGV's design was finalized, it had grown in weight to 40 short tons. The utter insanity of everything in FCS finally brought this $100 billion effort, the largest and most expensive ever undertaken by the Army, all crashing down at once in 2009, when Congress finally lost their patience and terminated the entire program. Not the least of the monumental blunders of FCS were that the computer hardware and software chosen for it was set in stone during the 1990s, allowing at least 7 generations of computer technology to overtake it. Or for that matter, that the bandwidth required to simultaneously operate and interlink everything FCS envisioned exceeded the entire electromagnetic spectrum. The MGV wasn't dead, however. The Army broke it off from the FCS program during the Great Collapse of 2009, and disguised it as a new effort with the euphemistic designation of Ground Combat Vehicle, or GCV. Begun in the same year the FCS program was cancelled. Seriously, the Army didn't even think to wait an entire year to revive the MGV to maintain the pretenses that it was a new project. And after talking themselves into believing that not an MGV could be built at a weight of only 30 tons, they issued an RFP, request for proposals, in 2010 for the new vehicle. As the GCV program progressed, the Army couldn't resist growing the not an MGV, with every subsequent official, committee, and decision maker involved in some way with the program adding increasingly more design changes, which were completely not for the sole purpose of feathering their own nests. And the result was a vehicle expected to weigh 70 short tons. You can't make this shit up. But if you think the Army reached peak levels of stupidity by then, you clearly still don't have the slightest perception of the bureaucratic morass that resides inside the five-sided squirrel cage. Buoyed by the smug sense of superiority and supreme self-confidence only US generals, admirals, and depraved civilians can have, the US Army proudly unveiled the finalized GCV design in 2012. It weighed 84 short tons. To put that into perspective, the heaviest armored vehicle put into service since World War II at that time had been the M1A2 Abrams SEP version 2, which weighed a full 12 short tons less than the GCV. 12 short tons, incidentally, is a difference equal to the combat weight of an M113A2 APC. Congress was not amused. They essentially told the Army to either get lighter or get f***ed. Instead, the Army officially terminated the GCV program in 2014. They eventually started a new Bradley replacement program in 2017. However, the name of the new program alone proved that the Army wasn't just building castles in the sky, but moving into them. It was named the Optionally Manned Combat Vehicle, or OMFV. By definition, an infantry fighting vehicle isn't optionally manned. Nevertheless, the defining attribute of the OMFV was that the Army wanted it to eventually be able to operate autonomously, with no track commander, driver, or gunner. Those roles would instead be assumed by a collection of random and ill-fitting computer hardware and software left over from the starting date of the program, all designed and built for the OMFV by the lowest bidder, which would make it, and it alone, decide who lives and who dies, and whether or not to ever let passengers enter, or leave on whims that mere human minds can't comprehend. Presumably, if we take this philosophy to its logical conclusion, the OMFV's successor would be the engines of penance. But don't worry, because specialists from big government, big tech, big defense, and the geniuses behind the 30-ton GCV would be the ones overseeing this project, so us mere mortals have nothing to fear. The Army invited at least 5 different manufacturers to compete for the contract to produce the OMFV, but ultimately only 2 of them bothered to show up, General Dynamics, and a team of Raytheon and Rheinmetall. One of the manufacturers the Army contacted was British Aerospace, the company that inherited the Bradley from United Defence, but they refused to participate. Which totally couldn't have been an omen heralding the imminent demise of the OMFV program. The vehicles submitted were the Rheinmetall KF-41 Lynx, which was offered to be built under license in the US by Raytheon, and the GDLS Griffin III. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Griffin, it's an over-engineered asset flip of the Spanish-Austrian Escod infantry fighting vehicle, which had been a contemporary and peer of the Bradley. In other words, it was a Cold War era design at the end of its rope, just like the Bradley, and that tray was the entire reason the Army intended to replace the Bradley. But in any case, the Griffin III arrived in time for the competition, but the Lynx didn't, effectively disqualifying it from the program entirely. This rather awkward outcome meant no competition at all, which in turn meant no procession to deciding which vehicle to buy. Which, needless to say, meant the end for the OMFV. The OMFV program was officially terminated in 2020, but it was effectively restarted almost unchanged later the same year under the new designation of NGCV, or Next Generation Combat Vehicle. Which totally didn't jinx the new program, by having 3 of its 4 letters evoke the accursed GCV disaster that made this effort necessary in the first place. If you somehow failed to notice that the NGCV is just the OMFV with a funny hat on it, consider that in July of 2021 the US Army invited 5 companies to submit design proposals. These were American Rheinmetall, British Aerospace Systems, General Dynamics Land Systems, Oshkosh Defense, and Point Blank Enterprises. For those of you who haven't already read the documentation by now, these were all the same companies the Army had previously contacted to submit proposals for the OMFV. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the Bradley has finally found new export customers. One has already put them into service, and the other has them on order. However, if you're expecting these nations to be titans among NATO's first-line member states, like the US Army and United Defense have insisted all along would ultimately cave and buy Bradleys, think again. The new Bradley operator is Lebanon, with 32 vehicles, while the one with Bradleys on order is Croatia, for 76 vehicles. Please, try to contain your excitement. However, Croatia's Bradley purchase isn't finalized yet. The associated documentation published by the US government on December 1, 2020 concerns only approval for the Croatian purchase, not confirmation that it has actually taken place. Meanwhile, since Saudi Arabia bought Bradleys in the mid-1990s, the AIFV and its derivatives have proliferated to Chile, Jordan, Libya, Malaysia, Morocco, the Philippines, Taiwan, and the UAE. Countries with a choice in the matter don't dare to touch the Bradley with a 10-foot pole, even though most of them are de facto vassal states of Washington, D.C. Even APC versions of the humble M113 have seen more export customers since the Bradley sailed to Saudi Arabia, ending up in the armed forces of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Lithuania, and Poland, none of whom had ever operated M113 variants prior to these purchases. With more than 50 nations having acquired some 85,000 M113s and their more than 250 variants, the Bradley that failed to replace it has a lot of catching up to do. Meanwhile, as the Bradley is struggling to sell abroad, Russia's BMP-3 is thriving. Since the Bradley was exported to Saudi Arabia, BMP-3s have been exported to Cyprus, Indonesia, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Morocco, Nicaragua, Sri Lanka, South Korea, the UAE, and Venezuela. Greece and India also had orders for the BMP-3, though they eventually fell through, and as of late 2021, several other countries are currently negotiating for BMP-3 purchases. One of these is Saudi Arabia, who intends to replace their Bradleys with BMP-3s. Oh snap. It is also telling that Iraq never replied to purchase Bradleys, having fought both against them in the Persian Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq, and alongside them in the Iraq War. They've seen firsthand the terrible and inevitable consequences of the US Army's error of developing the Bradley. Note also that Iraq did in fact request and receive M113s, and drives them into battle almost daily without issue or complaint. In short, for the Bradley's export sales to start becoming relevant, they have a lot of catching up to do. It was finally announced in the mid-2010s that work on an A4 generation of the Bradley fighting vehicle had begun, and in 2017, the first A4 Bradleys were delivered to the US Army. The A4 upgrade added a new and stronger torsion bar suspension, as well as new and lighter tracks, which are intended to significantly improve the Bradley's payload and ground clearance. A new power pack with a new engine and transmission were added, to compensate for the increased weight of the vehicle. A substantially expanded electrical system for the A4 Bradley includes an APU, or Auxiliary Power Unit, which is basically a small generator, as part of what the Army describes in its own words as a smart power management system. Another reason the A4 Bradley was developed is that the Army intends to outfit the Bradley fleet with an APS, or Active Protection System, which was the main reason the power supply was expanded, and an expanded C3I systems are included in the A4 upgrade as well. The A4 Bradley's increased power supply also has publicists pretending to be journalists everywhere becoming soy-faced over the potential for the A4 Bradley to use its power supply in a laser weapon or an electromagnetic gun. Because all of the research has shown tremendous success in the development of fringe magnet guns and death rays, whose practical application as weapons is always just a few years into the future. as it has been for more than 80 years now. However, the most pressing matter of the A4 Bradley, no pun intended, is its weight. Before I address that, let's go on a short trip down memory lane. Recall the Army's pitch for the Interim Armored Vehicle program back in the late 1990s that argued the Bradley was too heavy for them to deploy rapidly enough for them to maintain relevance. Their claim was that the infantry were all riding in either big, hulking 30-ton A2 and A3 Bradleys that took too long to deploy rapidly, or thin-skinned Humvees that were not survivable in a firefight. The Army used this as a case to establish the IAV program, which called for a new vehicle weighing less than 20 short tons for rapid tactical airlift via C-130, and the Army ended up buying the Stryker. I guess we are not going to mention the more than 10,000 M113A3 variants in active use at that time, the nearly 5,000 earlier M113 variants still in service at that time, the 20,000 others in storage. At that time, that United Defense already had the M113A4 ready for production, or that this was the outcome in spite of the Army's previous effort to completely supplant the M113 with the Bradley altogether. In fact, the image you're seeing right now is one of the graphics the Army published as part of the sales pitch for the IAV program. The Strykers all weighed too much for the C-130 to airlift them in an operational capacity, defeating the entire purpose of the IAV program. But I digress. The point of that long tangent is that the 30 short ton weight of the Bradley all by itself was enough to cause a crisis of confidence in the Army, particularly in the wake of humiliating blunders like Task Force Eagle and Task Force Hawk. In fact, we'll be looking into Task Force Hawk briefly later in this presentation, in a longer tangent. So how much do the new A4 Bradleys weigh, I hear you asking? 45 short tons. Yes, the Army has screwed up so incredibly badly that they actually drove the Bradley's weight upward by a crushing 50%. 45 short tons is also, incidentally, the combat weight of a T-72 main battle tank. Couple this with the fact that the new M1A2C Abrams weighs over 80 short tons, and that the Strykers, that mostly weighed just over 20 tons in their original iterations now weigh more than 25 short tons in their current A1 iterations, and you have a US Army that has become more of a parody of itself than ever before. But don't worry, the US Air Force is developing a supersonic VTOL stealth strategic airlifter to transport them, the F-35 of cargo planes. Your tax dollars at play, ladies and gentlemen. The worst part of the Bradley's new 45-ton weight is that none of the extra 15 tons comes from added armor. This was confirmed in an interview with Brigadier General David Bassett in the October 21, 2014 Army.mil article titled Upgrades New Normal for Armor in Uncertain Budget Environment. Here is a screenshot of that very paragraph, in case the Army tries to cover their tracks again, like they did with the weight of the MGV. As for when the A4 Bradleys will become operational, I would normally say, don't hold your breath, but in this case, it might be a good idea. Remember earlier when I mentioned the A4 Bradley's smart power management systems? As is usually the case, there's smart, and there's Army smart. On January 25, 2021, Defense News reported that field testing of the A4 Bradleys has been put on hold due to their new batteries releasing poisonous vapors into the fighting compartment. This happened in literally every single vehicle that was being tested, which needless to say, is not a good omen for the A4 Bradley's future. The cause of the off-gassing from the batteries is even more ridiculous, in that the manufacturer somehow failed to foresee the need to install a voltage regulator in the battery charger. Some smart power system that turned out to be. Congress is not amused, and in response they slashed the FY 2021 budget for the A4 Bradleys by $160 million. Not only that, but the original requirement for the A4 Bradleys was for a mere 475 vehicles. When you consider that Bradleys will be simultaneously based in the lower 48 states, Guam, South Korea, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and possibly Alaska and Hawaii, just to name a few, it immediately becomes obvious how impotent a force of only 475 A4 Bradleys is for the US military. But don't worry, the Army has already started an A5 Bradley program. The M2A5 and M3A5 were to be equipped with an unmanned turret, armed with the Bushmaster Mark 44 autocannon. However, the new turret and gun inadvertently ended up making the vehicle worse. For starters, having an unmanned turret meant that the A5 Bradley lost its unrestricted top vision, as the TC no longer has a hatch on the roof to stand up through. The Army pretended that a huge array of cameras providing 360-degree visibility from inside the vehicle was a substitute, as though these wouldn't inevitably be blinded by the mud, dust, debris, and peppering of small arms fire, shrapnel, and shell splinters that all armored vehicles accumulate in the field. An unmanned turret also means that reloading the weapons, clearing stoppages, replacing worn-out gun barrels on the coaxial machine gun, and numerous other tasks requiring direct physical access to the weapons necessitate having crewmen open an access panel and climb up into the turret, effectively defeating the purpose of making it unmanned in the first place. If the armor is penetrated in an unmanned turret, and the ammunition inside cooks off or explodes, legend has it that magical blow-off panels on top of the turret will vent the blasts away from the crew and out of the vehicle. The reality is that the path of least resistance for an ammunition explosion in an unmanned turret is through the access hatch underneath and into the fighting compartment. As for the new gun, the Mark 44 is just an M2-42 rechambered in the 30x173mm round, and thus it has all the same issues as we've seen before. Moreover, while the 30x173mm round has been used by the US Air Force since the 1970s, it has never been part of the US Army's inventory. The craziest part of all is that the A5 Bradley was expected to reach a weight of 50 short tons. That's only 2 tons short of the weight of an M60A3 Patton main battle tank. Or to put it another way, that's the weight of an original M2A0 Bradley from the mid-1980s, with another M2A0 Bradley stacked on top of it. The M2A5 Bradley was also supposed to have an expanded passenger capacity of 9 men instead of 6, but as you will see in the next section of this update, it is extremely improbable that this feat could have been accomplished. Ultimately, Congress lost their patience with the A5 Bradley and just cancelled it outright in 2021. The Bradley is truly the gift that keeps on giving. You might want to pause the video and comfortable, because part 6 is going to be the longest segment. This is despite the fact that the AMPV was admittedly an afterthought in the development of this presentation. I've paid little attention to it over the years, but the deeper I look into the AMPV, the more astonished I was at how bad this design is. The AMPV is an offshoot of the Bradley fighting vehicle, with the same hull, powertrain, and running gear as the A3 generation. It has a modular chassis with multiple subvariants that have already been developed and is intended to replace the M113 Gavin FOV. However, there's a few things wrong with the AMPV. And by a few things, I mean all the things. For one, the AMPV is supposed to represent a huge increase in protection over the M113, but we already know this isn't the case. For starters, consider the side armor of an M113. I'm going somewhere with this, so bear with me. The side armor of an M113 is 44mm of 5083 aluminum, and 200mm of 5083 aluminum is equivalent in ballistic protection to 125mm of RHA steel. In other words, the armor on the side of the M113 offers 0.625 times its equivalent thickness in steel. For 44mm of aluminum, that's an equivalent to 27.5mm of RHA steel. Thus, to penetrate the side of an M113, an offending projectile must be rated to penetrate at least 27.5mm of steel. Remember that figure. The original M2 Bradley and M3 CFV weighed 25 short tons, while the AMPV weighs a little over 20 tons, meaning the AMPV isn't much better armored than the M2 and M3, assuming it even has any more armor at all. Now consider that the armor on the side of the M2 and M3 was strengthened in the A1 generation, when the aluminum outer layer was swapped for a steel replacement. On the A2 generation, this was augmented by yet another steel plate, and until the A3 generation, the armor on the sides of the A2 was the strongest ever used on an operational Bradley variant. That said, all of the Bradleys that fought in Desert Storm were A2s, including Bradley No. A36, which participated in the Battle of Phase Line Bullet. During that battle, the hull was fully penetrated through all of that side armor, and the offending projectile shattered the transmission, immobilizing and effectively defeating A36. That projectile was a measly 12.7mm machine gun bullet. Recall that the side armor of the M113 is 44mm thick, and thus equivalent to 27.5mm of RHA steel. The Iraqi 12.7mm machine guns used in that battle all fired the 12.7 by 108mm round, and the best armor penetration for this caliber comes from the 57BZ 542M armor-piercing incendiary round, whose best performance is penetrating up to 25mm of RHA steel at a distance of 100 meters. It would have to penetrate another 2.5mm of steel to penetrate the side of an M113, but that's not all. Those machine guns would only have been firing ball rounds, not armor-piercing rounds, and the 12.7x 108mm ball round is the 1SL, which has only a fraction of the penetration. Even the more powerful API version of the 12.7 by 108mm round won't penetrate the side of an M113, but a mere 12.7mm ball round penetrated the thickest armor on an M2A2 Bradley. A mere ball round that would have bounced off the side of an M113 fully penetrated the thickest armor on an M2A2 Bradley, which is much more heavily armored than an M2A0 Bradley. And an M2A0 Bradley without its turret is what the AMPV is. Despite weighing twice as much as the M113, the AMPV has only a fraction of its protection. The army would also much prefer that you didn't know they actually evaluated all of the AMPV's different roles for the Bradley way back in the 1970s and rejected them because the results were always inferior to the M113 variants they would have replaced. Due to the smaller usable interior volume of the Bradley, weapon carriers such as mortar and tank destroyer vehicles were found to be incapable of carrying as much ammunition as their M113 based counterparts already in service. The IFV-CFV Special Study Group formed at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in March 1978, under Brigadier General Fred Mahaffey, also specifically noted that a Bradley-based tank destroyer armed with a tow missile wasn't going to be a cost-effective successor to an M113-based equivalent. Consequently, the Army acquired the M113-based M901 ITV in 1979, and no dedicated Bradley-based tank destroyer was ever developed. The AMPV is advertised as having an 80% larger interior volume than the M113. However, this claim doesn't hold water, no pun intended. The Army would much prefer that you didn't recall the fact that the AMPV's interior is the same diameter and height as the M2 Bradley's passenger compartment, in which passengers sit with their helmets against the ceiling and their knees interlaced. The Bradley's fighting compartment for the TCN gunner was even more confined, as you can see simply by looking at the widely published diagrams of the vehicle's interior. By contrast, the M113's interior provided not only more headroom, but also enough space in between the 10 passengers on the left and right sides, that an anchoring point for an additional jump seat was integrated into the middle for an 11th passenger. All of this was also before the A3 upgrades to the M113 FOV, which moved all of the fuel cells into armored and self-sealing tanks on the exterior of the vehicle's rear sponsons, which freed up even more interior volume. This was also before the A4 generation of M113s, now today called the MTVL, that was developed in the 1990s, which stretched the interior compartment by an entire section. The M577A3 command post carrier has an even larger interior volume of 394 cubic feet, while the stretched M577A4 has an interior volume of 502 cubic feet. All that removing the turret and its adjoining basket accomplished is eliminating a thin partition between these spaces, and photos of the AMPV's interior clearly shows much of the AMPV's volume in the forward area is visibly unusable because the Bradler's turret base plate still remains on the floor. The fact that the base plate remains after the considerable amount of work and money sunk into developing the AMPV indicates that this fixture is so deeply integrated into the hull that removing it is impossible. The M113's floor never had an integral base plate, though as proven by its countless subvariants, this was never an obstacle to installing a turret. However, not only does the AMPV offer less usable space than the M113A3, but it's also literally twice the size of the M113A3, as well as almost twice its weight. Then again, it's not the first time the Army has failed so comically in this regard. The Army also isn't above bold-faced lies about the AMPV, including the claim that, while it's expected to have a maintenance cost of $90 per mile, the M113 FOV is said to have a cost of $58 per mile. The latter figure is bogus. In year 2000, TACOM, the US Army's Tank and Automotive Command, recorded the M113 FOV as costing only $2 per mile. Unless the Army made a concerted effort to neglect maintenance on the M113 FOV, there's no way they could possibly have become more than 25 times as expensive to operate in less than 20 years, especially considering that almost all of them in service from then onwards were built in the late 1980s and early 1990s. By contrast, TACOM's data from the same time period shows the Bradley then cost $75 per mile. The false $58 per mile figure is also an obvious red herring attempt to prevent the Stryker from potentially threatening the AMPV program, as its operating cost of $75 per mile is the same as the Bradley. The unit cost of the AMPV is equally farcical. Compared to the $300,000 M113A3 Gavin it failed to replace, the AMPV costs $1,800,000. If the growth of the cost of the Stryker from a promised $800,000 price tag to over $11 million apiece in less than 10 years of production is anything to go by, the AMPV's contribution to the national debt has only just begun. However, I've saved the biggest AMPV showstopper for last. The dirty little secret is that, even though none of them will have existed before, none of them will actually be new. The last time a new build Bradley chassis rolled off the assembly line was before year 2000, and all of the Bradley variants constructed since then are factory rebuilds of old hulls taken out of storage. Meaning, all of the AMPVs will have to be converted out of Bradley fighting vehicles. By act of Congress, all assembly lines for military hardware that cease new build production are immediately disposed of in one way or another, as soon as production ends, in compliance with arms control laws and international treaties. Some tooling is allowed to be retained for maintenance, repairs, and the construction of some spare parts, but never the construction of new vehicles. Sometimes these assembly lines are disposed of by exporting them, such as the M113 FOV's assembly line equipment that was sold to FNSS in Turkey, but the assembly line equipment for the Bradley was never exported. Unless the assembly line is transferred to another country, all of the jigs, dies, presses, and all other tooling and machinery required to build new vehicles are irreparably destroyed on the spot, along with all associated documentation. The press first became widely aware of this law in 1992, when they asked the US Navy about the possibility of reviving the recently terminated F-14 Tomcat program. They were told this would never happen, because in accordance with said laws, all of the resources required to build more F-14s had already been destroyed. The impossibility of new build AMPVs is also betrayed by the number the US Army has officially ordered, some 2,907 vehicles, compared to a total of 6,724 Bradlers that were built for the US Army. In other words, as the AMPV's production continues, watch as the US Army either shows their Bradley inventory plummet dramatically without comment, or otherwise chooses not to reveal the number in their inventory to the public. And in case you're wondering about how the A3 and A4 Bradlers came about, which were all built after year 2000, all of them are rebuilds of the A2. The A2 Bradleys replaced the previous A1 model in production and development in 1988. They carried substantially more armor and much more advanced electronics than the A1s, and had a completely new suspension, running gear, and powertrain added specifically to carry the extra weight. The last of 3,053 A2 Bradleys rolled off the assembly line in the late 1990s, and the Army declined on further new build Bradley construction, effectively ending new build production. The A0 and A1 generation Bradleys were all retired from frontline service in the 1990s, and gradually withdrawn from service altogether during the 2000s, and it's not hard to understand why. They simply weren't sustainable anymore, nor interoperable with the A2 and later generations. As every single export Bradley so far have been A2 models, and the preceding models have all been in storage for more than a decade by now, it's pretty obvious which of the Bradleys will be converted into AMPVs. Namely, the A0s and A1s built between 1980 and 1988. Since converting A2s and later models would disrupt the availability of the Army's operational IFVs, it's almost certain that only the A0s and A1s will be converted into AMPVs. In other words, the AMPV fleet will in its entirety be older than nearly all of the personnel who will be expected to ride them into battle. The bitter irony is that the Army's M113 fleet is actually newer than the AMPV it intends to replace them with. Every single A3 M113 variant ever operated by the US military, of which the US Army bought some 10,000, including 6,000 M113 A3s, was built from scratch from 1987 to 1992. In short, the Army won't upgrade the vehicles built for them in 1987 to 1992 because they are too old, but they will upgrade the vehicles they built from 1981 to 1988 because they are all completely new. Oh, and that's another thing. 2,907 AMPVs can't replace over 10,000 M113s. Not when the Pentagon owns more than 800 military bases in at least 40 different countries, and continues to expand its reach into every new region possible, while trying to stay in every previous one possible. This means one of four things will happen over the remainder of this decade. Scenario 1. The Army will announce that 2,907 AMPVs somehow aren't enough, and call for the development of a new and original APC. Scenario 2. The Army will announce that more AMPVs are needed, and elsewhere will separately announce an accelerated retirement of the Bradley fighting vehicle. Scenario 3. The Army will suddenly out of nowhere start singing a different tune about the 20,000 M113s they have in storage, without comment on 2,907 AMPVs not being enough. And finally, Scenario 4, the Army will order more strikers to fill out the rest of their light armor, without comment on the 20,000 M113s in storage, the impossibility of building more than about 3,000 AMPVs, or the very real possibility all along of simply acquiring a license-built version of a foreign APC like the G5 or ACVS. There also seems to be no discussion of the M113A4, known in Canadian service as the MTVL, and previously designated as the M113A3+. The M113A4 was a phenomenal improvement over the M113A3, and is more than just a longer M113. The hull was lengthened by an entire section and a sixth road wheel was added on each side, offsetting the increase in weight with a reduction in the vehicle's ground pressure, and increased its buoyancy, which allowed the M113A4 to retain its predecessor's amphibious capability, just to name a few of its improvements. The M113A4's longer hull also increased the interior volume by 33%, to a total of 400 cubic feet, while still retaining the same passenger capacity. The extra weight was also more than compensated for by a 400 horsepower engine and a new 4-speed transmission, enabling a road speed of 45 miles per hour with standard tracks, and 60 miles per hour with band tracks. The M113A4 was already available for production by the mid-1990s, and was purchased by Canada as the MTVL and Australia as the M113AS4. M113A4s were also produced in Turkey by FNSS as the ACVS, now called the ACV-19, which is operated by the armed forces of Jordan, Malaysia, Turkey, and the UAE. The US Army, however, tries to pretend the M113A4 never existed. Another interesting game of make-believe is the sudden move by the system's mouthpieces to try to rewrite the history of the AMPV, and are claiming that the AMPVs aren't rebuilt Bradleys. The obvious reason why is that the protection scheme which defines a Bradley is almost universally understood to have made it a death trap. I've brought up the fact that the AMPV is only a rebuild of the Bradley, which seems to have struck a nerve, as my critics have begun a charade that the AMPV isn't a turretless Bradley. This, despite more than 6 years of journalism correctly identifying the vehicle as a turretless Bradley, and the manufacturer themselves originally advertising it as such. One last thing worth considering is that the name of this vehicle, the Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle or AMPV, is an obvious reference to the program that created the M113. The development program for the M113 was dubbed AAMPVF, which is an acronym for Airborne Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle Family. Note the airborne part of that program name. One of the central qualifiers for service was that the resulting APC was to be transported and airdropped by a C-130 Hercules, which was introduced into the US Air Force in 1956. The importance of the vehicle being airmobile is further evidenced by the fact that the M113's prototype, the T113, was chosen over the competing T117 prototype because the T113's aluminum construction made it several tons lighter than the steel-hulled T117. Note that the only A in AMPV isn't short for airborne. Also, let's go on a tangent regarding the Striker, the M113, and the Army's new MPF program. This will take a while, but it's a necessary refresher to fully comprehend how wrong the AMPV is. Recall that one of the main reasons the Striker was such a disaster was because it was too large and heavy to be air deployable via C-130, and that the Interim Armored Vehicle Program the Army selected the Striker for mandated this capability. The Interim Armored Vehicle Program, in turn, had been an emergency response by the Army leadership to the failure of Task Force Hawk, a rapid deployment force meant to move a US Army battalion to a location in Albania in 1999, in support of NATO operations in the ongoing Kosovo War. Task Force Hawk was originally to have been a much smaller operation, but the Army leadership's typical inability to resist mission creep meant that it was quickly expanded in scope and included huge amounts of exceptionally large cargo. The added-on large cargo in question were mostly M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, and the M270 MLRS. When transported by air, these vehicles are what are technically referred to as outsize cargo. Outsize cargo is essentially anything that is either too large or too heavy to be carried inside a tactical airlifter like the C-130 Hercules. Truly gargantuan strategic airlifters are required to lift outsize cargo, such as the C-5 Galaxy and C-17 Globemaster III. That said, it took over 2 months and 200 sorties to airlift everything Task Force Hawk was to use, even though all sorties were done with monolithic C-5s and C-17s, with most of their combined fleet diverted to support this one operation. By the time Task Force Hawk had just begun to unpack enough to start combat operations, the war ended, and they never fired a shot in anger. The problem is, there were never going to be enough strategic airlifters to support another operation like Task Force Hawk within a strategically viable time frame. The last new-built C-5 to roll off the assembly line entered service in 1985, and only a few hundred C-17s were either built or on order. This, to not only support contingencies like Task Force Hawk, but also simultaneously sustain all of what was to become 800 bases in 40 nations. No successor to either of these aircraft was seriously pursued by the US Air Force, which remains true to this day. The rapid deployment of large and viable ground combat formations by air was, and remains a mission-critical capability for the US Army, and achieving this fleet would obviously only occur if the considerably larger number of C-130s were able to airlift at least the bulk of those forces. This again brings us back to the Striker, that it was meant to be airlifted via C-130, and it couldn't be, resulting in an imbroglio to surpass Task Force Hawk itself. At its size and weight, which incidentally are growing unchecked, the Striker ended up itself being outsized cargo. Incidentally, those megaminds in the Pentagon never thought to include even a single example of an M113 variant in Task Force Hawk, in case you're wondering. This is all the more incomprehensible, given that not only were larger and heavier Abrams tanks deployed to Albania, but so too were the much smaller and lighter Humvees. No matter what you think of the M113's protection or mobility, if it's safe enough to send Humvees, it's safe enough to send M113s. Skipping a little bit further ahead into the future, the US Army initiated a new program in the late 2010s titled Mobile Protected Firepower, or MPF for short. To make a long story short, this program is intended to furnish the Army with a light tank small and light enough that not only can it be airdropped, but also airlifted and airdropped from a C-130. The favored contender so far is an updated version of the M8 Buford, which was actually developed way back in the 1980s, and which was almost adopted by the Army in the mid-1990s. Not only does the fact that the MPF program exists demonstrate how important rapid tactical airlift in sizable numbers is for the US Army, but as events in Kabul in August of 2021 have recently demonstrated, the security and sovereignty of US interests likely hinges upon being able to do so. So to sum it up, the M113 is small and light enough to be transported via C-130 in an operational capacity. Task Force Hawk failed. Because of excessive quantities of outsized cargo, the Striker itself became outsized cargo, and urgent need to have C-130 transportable light armor is demonstrated not only by the mere existence of the MPF program, but also recent events. And now that the aforementioned tangent is complete, you must be wondering, how does the AMPV relate to that? The AMPV is twice as large and heavy as the M113 it was meant to replace, despite having inferior protection, and weighs as much as a Striker. I also just remembered something important as I was typing the last lines in this presentation, which I forgot to mention earlier. Despite the claim that the AMPV is roomier than the M113, it only has space for 6 passengers. To reiterate, the M113 carries up to 11 passengers. This is the brainchild of the people we trust to defend the United States, and astoundingly, there are still people who trust their judgment. I need to stop this update here, or this will keep going on forever. This last segment is something I tacked onto the end of this presentation, even after it was proofread. This is because there's one additional variant of the Bradley that British Aerospace has been marketing recently, which I didn't become aware of until I was already in the process of creating this video. The new Bradley variant, pictured, is the Bradley M-SHORAD, a short-range air defense version of the Bradley armed with an automatic cannon and FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missiles. Incredibly, no one is laughing at British Aerospace for suggesting that a launcher for a 22-pound missile specifically designed to be fired off an infantryman's shoulder should instead have a 45-ton quasi tank attached to it. British Aerospace must think you're all stupid, because the Bradley M-SHORAD is literally just an asset flip of a vehicle the Army already used before, and knows better than to attempt again. Namely, the failed M6 Linebacker, which the Army got rid of entirely back in 2006 after just 7 years of operational service. The air defense role for this vehicle seems to be cursed. Quite a few Bradley-based air defense systems have been developed over the years, but all of them ultimately flopped, even the M6 Linebacker, despite actually entering service. British Aerospace is also really grasping for straws this time, because the US Army already fielded a Striker variant armed with the more formidable Sidewinder missile, and the Army aren't likely to risk a competing product in their arsenal outshining their golden child. In short, things aren't looking good for the M6 Linebacker. I mean, Bradley M-SHORAD. Yes, that's what it's called. However, the new Striker variant in question is a topic for a later video. Like this video, and subscribe to my channel. You'll be sorry if you don't.